Per project settings are now really easy to implement and enforce using an editor config. Let's see how in this 10-minute training video. Now, for most of my training, I work to give you an in-depth perspective on a technology. But sometimes you just need to get the quick answer to the question, how do I use this? That's why I created the 10-minute training series. So let's dive right into the code. And let's start by creating a new project. And we're going to select just a Blazor server project. That's fine for now, just to give us some kind of code to work with. This is not going to be anything in depth, just something to see. So we'll say Blazor demo and Blazor demo app. And we'll hit next. We'll leave the defaults here and hit create. Now, when you work with projects, you may have settings you want to have that are given for the project. For example, you may want to say, I want to use tabs rather than spaces, or spaces rather than tabs. I want the number of spaces in a tabbing to be 3 or 4. I want to have a certain layout for my if statements. Maybe the curly braces are always on a new line. Maybe it always enforces having curly braces. Maybe you want to use the new way of doing file scoped namespaces as opposed to the old way of doing things. So all these things are settings, are preferences. And you can set a lot of them by going to Tools, Options, and then putting some tweaks in here. However, this is per user in Visual Studio. And when we work with projects, we often work with projects with other people. And that means we don't always have the luxury of saying, everybody make your Visual Studio like this, because that may be different for every person. So instead we can say, for this project, this is how we want to do things. So let's look at Editorconfig, which allows this. I'm going to choose to create at the solution level an Editorconfig. I'll right click, I'll say add, new Editorconfig. Now, when it first comes up, it crashes like this. This is not a problem, but this is a quirk of Visual Studio where it says, hey, an error occurred when attempting to load the document. Not a problem. Close it out, open back up, and then it will open back up. And this is Editorconfig. Now, just to be clear, this is not a Microsoft thing. This is actually an industry thing that Microsoft is using. So this is something you'll see in other projects as well, not just C# projects. You may see it in a JavaScript application or other applications that have nothing to do with Microsoft. Just note that's the case. However, Microsoft has added a very nice user interface on the top so that we don't have to just know what the settings could be. We can look at the settings and make choices from that. So this has brought in my settings from my Visual Studio, for example. However, we can tweak or adjust them. For instance, in this white space section, notice the 4 tabs here. In the white space section, we could say, I want to use tabs instead of spaces. And I want a tab width to be 3. Well, now if I save this, this will enforce that for the entire solution of Blazor Demo app. It will not enforce it in other solutions, just in this solution. The great thing is, this Editorconfig can be put into source control. It's just a file, which means that you can then say everyone who uses this solution will use tabs with an indent size of 3, and it will not affect anybody else's Visual Studio for any other project. So it's just for the solution. So there's lots of settings in here. You can play around with looking at all the different options. For example, place open brace on a new line for types. Uncheck that, and will not do that. Most of these are set the way we normally do Visual Studio. However, there are things that you may say, you know what, I want to do differently. For example, code styles. This is one that I use quite a bit, and you may have seen me do before. And that is the namespace declaration. Right now it's set to block scoped. What that means is essentially the old style. Let's go to the data folder. We're going to right click and add a new class, and we'll just call it block scoped. And hit enter. And we do, this is the normal block scoped file. We have the namespace, curly braces, and then inside there our class name, and then I can put our code. And so our code is always going to be indented 2 levels. Now, note a couple of things. First of all, this right here is is a tab, but it's about 4 spaces, whereas this is less than that. So it's not, we'd have to do a reformat to apply the Editorconfig fully, because it is coming from a template. However, now that we have the block scope, I do want to show you the difference if we don't change anything else except come over here and say file scoped. Hit save, right click on data, say add class, we'll say file scoped. Notice now that namespace has a semicolon at the end and there's no curly braces. This is the newer way of doing namespaces when you have only one namespace per file. So this applied to the template, even though the template is the same template essentially, but it's saying, nope, you know what? I can reformat this to be the new style. So that is a nice option right there, but also notice it says disabled for severity. Now, what does that mean? Because it's applying it, so why is it disabled? Well, it's not disabling the ability to use it, it's just disabling this as a suggestion, warning, or error. So it won't show up in your error list. But if I had said error and hit save, then when I look back at my error list, you'll see this right here where it says convert this to block scoped namespace. So if I do this, convert to block scoped, now it's no longer going to be an error. But if I come back over here and say, no, I want, well, it's actually file scoped, that's a bug in Visual Studio, but it is allowing me to say, no, I want file scoped, or no, I want block scoped. So there are some quirks to this, like you've seen. There are some things that don't perfectly work quite yet, but they are coming. And some of it has to do with if you run a code cleanup. Running code cleanup will clean up some of the things that maybe didn't apply when the template was created, but would apply going forward. So just note that it's not going to be perfect, but it will get closer. There are naming styles as well as what you want to do for the various issues that might pop up. Do you want them to be warnings, or do you want to turn them off? This can all be done per solution or per project inside of Editorconfig. Now note, I put it at the solution level, which means it applies to every project. I could put Editorconfig inside this data folder. I could say new Editorconfig, and that would apply just to this data folder. And it would override the settings in this Editorconfig if there's a conflict. So you can have multiple if it makes sense, but if you just put it at the solution level, you can say, these are the rules for our solution and all the projects based upon what we want to do just for this one. We won't override your local settings, but we will override it in this project's case, and that's it. Okay, so that's Editorconfig. Try it out. I'd encourage you to use it. It's a great tool for making sure that you have consistency in your code.